All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Leslie Wade, and I am the program chair for the 2022 Good Fruit from the Ground Up Conference. This is our annual conference, and this is the second year we've done it virtually, and we are delighted that you're here. I know that other folks will be joining us, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. And thank you for the emoji reactions. Those are great. So tonight, I'm super excited. We're going to be talking about growing high yield fruit using espalier methods with author, lecturer, and farmed-in manager, Lee Reich. So before I introduce Lee, let me just take care of a few housekeeping items and tell you a little bit about NAFEX. So first of all, this is a webinar format tonight. So our guests will not be on camera, but you'll be fully able to participate in real time. So because it's a webinar, we're going to ask everyone to put your comments in the Q&A rather than the chat. A lot of times we're very familiar with the chat feature. We're going to just ask you instead to put your comments and questions in the Q&A, and we'll keep an eye on those and make sure that we get all the questions answered as we go along. And also, we invite you to share your experiences as well, in addition to asking questions. We're a membership organization. We have a lot of great fruit growers. Lee has been a longtime member. And so we've got a lot of good perspective and experience from those of you that are in the audience. So let's see. In Zoom, you have the ability to adjust your own screen view. So keep that in mind. And this webinar is being recorded. It's going to be on our website for NAFEX members for a year. And then after a year, we're going to go ahead and move it to the NAFEX TV YouTube channel. So it'll be available to an even larger audience. So just a few words about NAFEX. We were founded in 1967 and are a network of individuals throughout the US and Canada that are dedicated to the discovery, cultivation, and appreciation of superior varieties of fruits and nuts. Although our ranks of our membership include professional pomologists, nursery owners, commercial orchardists, NAFEX members are primarily amateur fruit growers in the truest sense of the word. We are motivated by our shared love of fruit. So we gather to share ideas, information, experiences, fruit propagation tips, and we share that through our website, through our quarterly Pomona Journal, through our social media channels. We have a very active Facebook group that now, as of tonight, has more than 7,000 members. And we do fruit-specific interest group sessions that are recorded like this, and we have a great archive of those from this past year, and we're going to be continuing that with monthly programs for our members. So it's all a pretty good value for $19 a year, we think. So we only exist because of fruit growers like you, and we encourage you to continue your membership. If you've just joined for this conference, please stay with us and be part of our fruit growing community. You can always learn more and find resources at our website at nafex.org. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Lee Reich. Lee Reich, PhD, dove into gardening decades ago, initially with one foot in academia as an agricultural scientist with the USDA and Cornell University, and one foot in the field, the organic field. He eventually expanded his field to a farmed-in, more than a garden, but less than a farm, and left academia to lecture, consult, and write. He has authored 9 books, and I have one here, which is one of my favorite. It's called The Pruning Book, and it's going to be relevant for what we're talking about tonight. You can find his books and more information about him on leereich.com. So, Lee, without further ado, I'm going to say let's turn it over to you and have you share your screen. And again, for those who've just joined us, feel free to please put your questions, comments, and share your experiences in the Q&A section.
Thank you, Leslie, and happy to be a member, and I've been a member since 1977. I was taking a fruit course way back then, and the professor mentioned NAFEX, and I thought I got to join this organization. And happy I did. So tonight I'm going to talk about espalier fruit. And what I'd like to do, share screen, right? Oop. So what I'd like to do is first talk a little about what espalier is and some of its historical underpinnings, And then since pruning is a very essential part of espalier, just to say a few words about how plants respond to pruning, because that's the key to know how a plant's going to respond before you prune. Talk a little about the forms of an espalier, and then get down to the nitty gritty of, what plants work best for espalier and how actually to prune different types of plants. And as Leslie pointed out, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A, and I will stop periodically just to sort of take a whole bunch of questions at once. So let's start out with the historical part. So espalier is, first of all, what is it? It's training plants to an orderly pattern of branches, usually a two-dimensional form. And the word came from the Old French word meaning aspau, the Old French word aspau, A-S-P-A-U, which means a prop. And most espaliers, in their youth at least, do need to be propped up against a fence or staked or be trained in some way. And espalier began in the 16th century when fruit trees were trained, as pictured here, against walls to gain extra heat. And this was about the time also what is called the Little Ice Age in Europe, where temperatures were much, much cooler for a while. And so against a wall, the walls would gather the sun's heat and then re-radiate it when the sun wasn't there. So you can grow things and ripen fruits that need heat much better against a wall. And one question is, here's another one, is another shape of espalier against a wall. A lot of these photos I have are from old books, so the quality, and then I copied them, so the quality isn't that great, but take that into consideration. So what are some of the advantages of espalier? Well, this is some espalier at Monet's garden in Giverny, and then one thing I really like about espalier, so my background is in science and practical background, and I like the way espalier, it's a decorative form, but it also uses science to coax a lot of fruit and flowers from the plant. So you can see in this photo, and I'll show more of these, the amount of fruit spurs, or you can see it's not a very clear photo, but you can see the flowers starting to open here, and you can see just the how many flowers you get per square foot of ground or per foot of stem. So that's one thing. It's really a nice commingling of science and art. You have the artful form, and you have the science to do the pruning and other techniques to make it have all those flowers and fruit. So here's another photo. So keep in mind the quantity of fruit that you get from this. This is from an old book, which I happen to have here. This is doesn't have a fancy cover, but this is a book called The Lorette Method of Pruning, which I'll get back to. And it was written in the late 1800s. I happen to have a copy from the early 1900s. So he was really the master of espalier. And the nice thing about espalier, this whole thing with science and art, not only does it train the stems, but there's a careful balancing of the number of the amount of leaves with the amount of fruit, so that you get very high quality fruit. And another nice thing is that you can see the way the stems would be just bathed in air and light. So this also increases the quality, decreases disease. And espalier is very decorative as part of a garden scene. This was a garden I visited in France, about 20 years ago. And I thought that if I could be offered a job in this garden when I visited, I would just start working there right away. It was a 4-acre walled garden with vegetables and these really beautiful old pear espaliers, which I'll show you more photos of that too. So it's just decorative part of the whole garden scene also. And one thing I particularly like about espalier, it takes a lot of pruning, more frequent pruning than conventional pruning. But the nice thing I like about it is that your feet are on the ground always. You don't have to climb a ladder. It's not heavy cuts. It's a lot of little cuts. And it's nice. So if you do it right, you make all these little cuts and you're very intimate with the plant. And if everything comes out okay, you have this beautiful plant with lots of really good tasting fruit. So it is a high maintenance technique, and I consider it to be fun. I like to prune. I wrote a book on pruning, but I think it's fun to see plants respond. So let me so that tells a little something about this history and the reason for espalier. This is real important, I think. How do plants respond to pruning? And this isn't just for espalier. This is how plants generally, all plants pretty much, respond to pruning. And so one thing is, anytime you prune a stem of a plant, and I'm talking about dormant pruning mostly, anytime you prune a stem of a plant, it will dwarf it to some degree. You're taking away some stored food, and you're removing growth, and the response is going to be less growth in the overall plant. But that's not the only response. Let's look at some of the other responses to different kinds of cuts. So there's basically two types of pruning cuts that you can make generally. One type, I think, can you see this as pointer?
I sure can.
Oh, yeah. So the one type is called a heading cut. And in a heading cut, you have a stem. This could even just be a young whip, but you could have a stem on a plant, and you shorten it. This is called a heading cut. And a heading cut could be as little as just pinching out the tip of a plant, or it could be taking out part of the stem as shown there, or it could be cutting it almost till you just leave that much. But at any rate, some part of the stem is left. And what that does is, at the tip of any stem is hormones produced called auxin. And this actually travels down the stem and suppresses growth of side buds down the stem. So if you take out the tip, and it suppresses growth of side buds, and mostly the ones closest to the tip. So if you take out the tip or some part of a stem, buds further down along the stem are no longer suppressed, at least temporarily, and then they can grow. So you take off, you cut that there, and then you're left with two shoots growth that might have those buds might have stayed dormant. So that you can see this would be useful for say if you want to get branching on a young plant, or if you just have some part of a plant that's just it's too open and you want more stem growth. So the other type of cut is thinning cut, and in thinning cut you can see here you basically remove a stem completely right to its base, and in this case the response is nothing. So nothing happens. The whole plant, as I said early on, is dwarfed because you are pruning something off. But as opposed to this, where there's this plant is dwarfed also, but there's a local stimulation. So if you read a lot of, especially older books, they'll say, well, the way to get more growth on a plant is to shorten the stems with a heading cut, and then you get all this growth. But that's true. But and people have done this, if you calculate the total growth on the plant, it will be less. But locally, right by the cut, you get more growth. So this is good if you have too much congestion in a certain area, you want more light and air in, you make the cut there. So that's not all though. So depending on looking at heading cuts, depending on the degree of heading will affect how much growth you get. So if you have, say, this could be a stem growing up on a plant, or it could be just a 1-year-old whip as shown here. And if you cut it, say, by 1/3 versus 2/3, if you cut it by 1/3, you get many side shoots, and each one doesn't grow that much. If you, on the other hand, cut it by 2/3, shorten it by 2/3, you get fewer side shoots growing, but each one grows more. So this is a good way to regulate how much, and it's all a matter of degree. And also it's a function of how inherently vigorous the plant is. An inherently vigorous plant will make more growth. So that's just other ways to regulate plant growth. And one more final slide here. So if you look at a plant as a whole or an individual stem, the higher limbs and stems are inherently more vigorous. They just will tend to grow more than lower ones. And this is why old apple trees that haven't been pruned, they tend to have a lot of growth up at their top and very little lower down. Another reason they have less lower down is because all that growth at the top is shading it lower down. And also, if you bend a stem in an arch, at that top point of the stem, you'll get a vigorous bud that'll grow up. And these 2 points are very important, as you'll see, for when it comes to training and pruning espalier. And this one is my favorite one then. So if you have a stem and it's vertical versus you look at a stem that's horizontally growing, the vertical stem is inherently more vigorous than the horizontal stem. And there's a balance in plants between stem growth and flowering and fruiting growth. So the more vigorous it is, the less flowering and fruiting there is. And this is why on water sprouts, on say apple trees, you get these very vigorous, they'll grow maybe 5 feet sometimes in one season. And they'll take a long time to start fruiting because they're just vigorous stem growth. And whereas if you see a horizontal stem, that one can often be fruiting much more than the vertical ones. And sometimes it's fruiting too much where the quality of the fruit isn't going to be good. So that's one thing, but you don't have to sit back and just look at the plant, the orientation of the stem and say, I wish that one was more horizontal or wish it was more vertical. If you actually take a vertical stem and you bend it down, that will make it less vigorous and more fruitful. And conversely, if you take a horizontal stem and bend it up, it will become less fruitful and more vigorous. And then it's not either here or here. You can also go halfway, or you can go a third of the way, or some amount of branch orientation, depending on the amount of vigor you want and the amount of fruitfulness you want. And this, as you'll see when you see the various forms of espalier, this is very important when it comes to training in espalier. This is one reason why these forms work so well, because orientation of the branch and pruning. So just one sort of demonstration. So here's a pear branch, and pears are often very slow to come into bearing. And if you bend them down, I mean, a lot of you probably do this in tree training rather than you have a young tree and just weight the branches down or tie them down, and this makes them come into bearing sooner. I could take any questions. If there are any quick questions.
I don't see anything in the Q&A. Something just popped in. Hang on a second.
There is one that just came in.
All right.
Does the relationship between vigor, fruiting, and stem orientation apply to all fruiting trees?
Pretty much, but some fruiting trees tend to be more apt to, tend to bear more fruits more readily than others. For instance, as I said, pears are very slow, whereas peaches are much more ready to bear fruits. But generally, that is the case with all plants, not just fruiting trees.
And someone asked, do the pruning methods against a wall differ for espalier trees versus stakes, those on stakes?
Not really. It's just, no, not at all. At least nothing I could think of. Why would it? Can that person suggest a reason why it might? Maybe I'm overlooking something.
Yeah, we'll see if they type anything in. In the meantime, does the position of the branch, vertical versus horizontal, have anything to do with the plant hormones?
Oh, yes, a lot. And, there's all sorts of explanations, and they change over the years, or they're modified over the years. But it's so much of what's going on when you prune, when you orient a branch, it's very much hormonal related. And you have the auxins, which do what I had just said with the, suppress growth further down. And there's other hormones that come into it, like cytokinins. There's many hormonal interactions. And with hormones, it's often a function of both the concentration of the hormone and the time of year and growth stage. So there's a lot of things that interact.
Okay. And one more question. Have you tried the newer method of cutting bark above or below buds rather than removing shoots?
You mean cutting bark below rather than removing shoots? That would be just to stimulate growth of a side bud. If you have a stem with a bud on it, you put a cut above it to try and get that bud to grow, versus shortening the stem. I mean, that is a good technique because you don't have to shorten the stem then, which, as I said, dwarfs a plant. And when a plant's young, you want to fill its allotted space as fast as possible. I have tried it. I don't think it's very new, though. This is something that people have been doing literally for, more than 100 years. But I have to say, in all honesty, that I've tried it many times, and it doesn't seem to work as well as you would think it worked, for me at least. And I'd be curious if anybody else, you do it. I mean, it seems sort of obvious because it would stop flow of something up, so it all goes to that bud, and then the bud grows. But I don't know. I've never seen that happen. But it's supposed to happen, and I wrote about it, doing it in my book.
All right. I think that those are the questions for now.
Okay. Right. I'll stop again. And so let's look at the parts of an espalier. And so there's a lot of different forms of espalier. There's a parts of an espalier shown here. So this is this first one's called a candelabra form, which can get much more intricate than this, but this is the basic one. So you have a short length of trunk, then you have this leader, and these are all permanent parts. And there's a branch that would be permanent also. Or actually, depending on the plant, the branch might be something that's pruned regularly, but the leader and the trunk definitely would be permanent parts. If you have this one, which is a horizontal palmette, here's the trunk, here's the leader, and you have branches. Oh no, you have arms, and there's a branch. And then the final one is a fan, although other people call it something different. We have the trunk, and geez, I can't even see what I had written there. Anyway, you have the trunk. Oh, I guess that's an arm. And a rib, which is a permanent or semi-permanent part, and then branches off the rib. And here's a form called an oblique cordon. This is at the well-known East Malling Research Station in England. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Malling rootstocks like Malling 9 and Malling Merton rootstocks, where they were developed here, where they were codified at the Malling Research Station about, once again, 100 years ago. And these are oblique cordons. They're apple trees trained to this form, this shape, and they're just a single stem. So they have a lot of different varieties here. This is one apple tree. There's another one. They're different varieties. And the reason that they're trained, they could be trained straight up. The reason they aren't trained straight up is because they would be too vigorous. And you can see the amount of fruit they're trying to get on these things. So by keeping them at this particular angle, they're getting a lot of fruit. And what angle you put it at is a function also of the rootstock, because the rootstock, especially the dwarfing rootstocks, induce early bearing and heavy bearing. So if you have a very dwarfing rootstock and you bend it down too much, you get a lot of fruit, but you won't get enough growth. You need stem growth, first of all, to hang the fruit on, and also for leaves to feed the fruit. Okay. So here's a form. This is another candelabra form, and you can see something how it's pruned. And let's just go from that. Here's another form. There's at that garden again. It was called St. John de Beauregard. This garden, this 4-acre walled garden, and these were, when this garden was taken over, there were a lot of old pear trees, such as this one, that had been neglected, and they were getting it back into shape, and looks like they had gotten it pretty much into shape. Oh, I just realized they're missing a branch here. I have to write them. No. But these were some of the finest espaliers. Well, one of the best gardens I ever visited, but also some of the best espaliers. This is one of my favorite forms. It's called en arcure. So you have a trunk and then you bend a branch over. Remember I said when you bend a branch like that, you get new vigorous growth from the top portion of that arch. So then you get a growth there, and it's a little easier to see in this diagram or this drawing here. So you can see you bend it there, you get vigorous growth there, and this, and you put them together, and they sort of hold each other up. And I'll show you in a little while. Oh, maybe the next slide. That I was trying to do this with some plants that I had. Well, when I show it, I'll describe it more. So this is also from that Louis Lorette book, who I said he was the master of espalier, and this is what's called a winged pyramid. So it's a three-dimensional espalier, and you can see the quantity of fruit he gets on this is amazing. Here's at the Mount Vernon Research Station in Washington State. I think this is the Home Orchard Society developed these espaliers, and you can see they've spelled out welcome on that. And I was there when they were in full bloom, and it's really quite a beautiful sight, and productive of good tasting fruit. So here's some other various forms of espalier: the yew palmette, candelabra, horizontal palmette, and all these forms. The important thing about them is, remember I was talking about the vertical growth versus horizontal growth, and the more vigorous growth from upper buds. So all these forms are trying to deal with this problem of vigorous growth where you don't want it. So for instance, this one, instead of having this go straight up, to a leader, where there'd be very vigorous growth from the top of the leader, so it splits into two. So at least it's split among 2 leaders. And this one, it's split even more as it goes up. So, and it starts out horizontally. So you have ways of not making parts of it over vigorous. In an espalier, it's very important to try and balance out the vigor, because there's always this tendency for the high up in the plant, more vigorous growth. So you want to keep it balanced throughout, both for looks and for productivity. So here's another way. You can see there's the leader, but here's the trunk, but all the leaders go horizontally to make them more fruitful. Another one, here's one that they're at an angle, is oblique palmette. And so you get the picture that you're trying to balance growth and suppress growth to some degree. Here's some, they get even more fancy. Like I like this one. So you have this, and then you just make these nice arches, and they get fruitful, or then you can get even more fanciful. And so there's all different ways of dealing with it. There's a quote I have from this book. It says, this is a book from 1869. It says, the vertical growth, and this is quote, throws trouble into the whole economy of the tree and paralyzes its production and compromises the very existence of the horizontal branches. So the whole purpose is, as another writer I have from a book not that long ago says, apical dominance upsets the whole economy of the tree. So you want to deal with this apical dominance. So basically, there's a lot of stem bending, pruning, and tying it to some structure to hold the plant in position, or the stem in position till you get where you want the shape you want to get in. It'll stay there because as it matures. I can take a few more questions. I see 5.
All right. Yeah. So this might have been held over from a little bit earlier. Jeannie asks, changing the this was an answer. Somebody to Jeannie's question said that changing the angle of a branch can absolutely affect the behavior of the branch, whether it fruits or creates more branches. So that's not a question, but just a comment. Right. Bradley asks, is oblique cordon always oriented toward a particular cardinal direction?
You mean like north, south, east, or west? Is that what cardinal means?
That's my assumption. Yeah.
Yeah. Not really, because the way, since it's two-dimensional, if the sun is comes from this side, the back is going to get just as much sun as the front side. If the sun's south of it, you still get sun on both sides. So I think it doesn't matter what direction it is.
Okay. And then kind of along those similar lines, is there a best angle for the cordons?
The single cordons, maybe referring to like the ones from the East Lawn Solar Station.
Yeah.
It really depends on the plant and the vigor of the rootstock and the variety, because certain, say, pear varieties or apple varieties are more vigorous than others. So you have to take that into account. But the nice thing about the single cordon, you can have a single cordon, and if it's growing too much, you can just bend it down a little. If it's not growing enough, you bend it up a little.
Good point. Eric asks, have you tried Espalier on mulberry, which tends to be much more vigorous than apple or pear?
I have not, but yes, it does tend to be more vigorous. Also, it's very fruitful, and it fruits on, I'm not sure, because I see it looks like it fruits on short growth of the previous season. So I think it would lend itself to Espalier. I wouldn't do it only because, mulberry fruit's only that big. And so you need a lot of stems, and you're going to have so many stems unless it gets very big. If you have like a reasonably sized Espalier, you can only have that many stems on it, and it would not be enough to, give enough mulberries. Not to mention it'd be a field day for birds. They'd have easy access at it.
Yeah.
But you could do it.
Okay. Sarah asks, does the significant increase in fruit production require shifts in nutrient and resource demands?
Well, yeah, that's part of the pruning of Espalier is not only to get a lot of fruit born, but not get too much. So you have to balance it out. And the nice thing about it also is that you get a lot of sunlight on each part of the stem. So you really you don't have to worry about shaded parts of the plant, taking food that's made in the sunny parts of the plant. So, but that is one key to Espalier. So, for instance, I'll show some Espaliers later of Asian pears where they can bear very heavily, and you have to thin them. Usually for mine, I thin, 3 or 4 times a season, and even then, it's too much.
So why don't we go ahead and go back to the presentation? We'll hold on to some of those questions.
Okay. So now we'll get to the nitty gritty of more here's some more forms. So the goal in Espalier is, first of all, to minimize branch growth. I mean, once you have the branch design, the tracery of the branch is the way you want to have it for decorative reasons. But then you also want to maximize flowering and fruiting. So those are the 2 goals. And then the bugaboo, the really glitch is when and how much do you cut stems? Because, a horizontal stem even is going to make shoots. So you're going to have to cut them at some point if you want to maintain the tracery of those branches. So when do you cut them, and how much? And that really is the key to Espalier, and not that easy to come up with. So here's a photo of pear Espalier. This was at the Cloisters Garden in New York City. It's part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So they have this nice little alcove, masonry wall. It's actually an old castle that was moved from Spain to the Bronx, or maybe it's Upper Manhattan, and they're training this pear Espalier. And this is when it's young. You can see it's got a nice form and everything, and it's got some structure to keep it trained the way, if you're going to have a good Espalier and you want a branch that goes up or at an angle, you want it to be straight, ideally, just for artistry. So you often use bamboo or something else to train it against. And one thing you should look at here is some people, when they have a espalier against a wall, they just think it's going to be flat against a wall. Well, first of all, that makes pruning hard, but it also makes it so that air can't get behind it, and so it's not good to have it right against the wall. You can see this is held off this wall by being the branches are being tied to this little wire that looks like it comes, maybe 6 or 10 inches off the wall. And also hard to prune if it's right against the wall, because there'll be a lot of stems growing backwards. Here it is later. So you can see all this growth that's, not later, this is when it was a little older, but you can see all this growth that's coming off. And so this is what I'm saying, the bugaboo is you want fruit along here, and you have this growth, and you also want to see the tracery of the branches. So here you don't see fruit or the tracery of the branches. It could be that the plant's not yet old enough, but you have to figure out how to prune this so it still looks good and will bear fruit. Here's another one. This is in Williamsburg, Virginia. These are apple trees, and you can see there's a horizontal stem there, horizontal stem there. And you could see in the upper part of the plant, see how much more growth there is compared to the lower part. And this should be flowering or fruiting, and it isn't, because this is just a lot of vigorous growth. And the way they prune this is to keep it sort of looking like an espalier, they just keep pruning all this growth, but it's really just pruning it, then you get more growth. You prune it again, you get more growth. So, because remember I said a heading cut often stimulates more growth. So that's what's happening here. So they're not getting any fruit, and they're getting a lot of vigorous growth here that has to be pruned basically every year, just the same way, or maybe a few times a year. So getting back to Monsieur Lorette, he in his book, he has all sorts of techniques, which I've tried for pruning. That's this old book again. And the main thing, it's a whole book on pruning, so he has all these, wrinkles on it. But the main thing, what he does, is he, when a stem grows, sometime in June, you get all this growth, and the stem will be, so his rules, when the stem's about pencil thick and sort of half woody, you shorten it to just the whorl of buds, to about 1/4 of an inch to the whorl of buds at the bottom of the stem. And the whole purpose of this is not to stimulate new growth after that, but if you do this and it works as hoped, you get instead of new growth, you get for a pear tree, you get a spur, which is a fruiting. And I think I have a picture. Oh, actually, this is a picture here. Well, I should. Let me go back to this one. This is a stem. And this is a spur of a pear tree, and this whole spur here, this is about maybe 2 inches high. So it's a very short unit, and it looks almost like a little tree the way it branches and everything. And this is how pear trees fruit, and apple trees, and some other plants. So they have these fruiting spurs. So the goal in Lorette pruning, when you cut this back, instead of having a new shoot growing by timing, which he says, when it's this long, about 1 foot long, half woody and about pencil thick, you cut it back to a 1/4 of an inch or so, and then you get some growth, but it's a spur. And this will make, if that's along the stem and you had this growth and you cut it back, that's how you get these fruiting spurs along the stem. So that technique was modified by the British, and they had a technique where you shorten it. Don't read this too closely, and I'll tell you why in a second, but you shorten it first in winter, then you shorten it again, and a technique that causes spurs. And then they came up, but they thought that was a little too much pruning. I remember my professor, when he was describing this, he said that that it turns out the British like to go fishing in summer, so they didn't want to spend that much time, because the Lorette method, that's not just once. In a month, you come back and you do the same thing. Maybe you get new growth. Maybe it didn't make a spur and it made new growth. So there's techniques you do, almost the same thing, and maybe there's new shoots also. But the British didn't want to come back every month, so they want to go fishing. So they came up with a modified Lorette technique. So I'm going to skip over this before anybody jots it down to, thinking that's going to work. So here's a photo of apple espalier. So the thing I want you to notice on here is the lack of fruit. So a lot of times people will buy, they sell pre-espaliered trees in nurseries sometimes. And some nurseries specialize in espaliered trees, and people buy them and they think they got this beautiful tree and it's going to be bearing fruit, and then they don't know how to prune it, so it makes a lot of shoot growth, and maybe they cut it back randomly, and it's very easy actually to train an espalier even to a form like this, but to train the branches however you want them to go, especially if you know those basic pruning techniques. Much harder is to have these branches. Remember the picture I showed, the photo I showed of Monet's garden? Maybe I have it next. Oh, this is another. Well, so you can see it's easy to train to the branches, but hard to get fruit clothing all the branches. Whereas a really good espalier, I think this is the one at the cloisters again, still no fruit on it, but it is trained. The branches look the way they're supposed to look. Here's another one. You can see there's a few flowers up on top. Here's another one. Here's a fruit there. There's a few fruits here and there, but mostly it's just, a nice form. And compare that with this. So it's, there's a technique to pruning. And here's Monet's garden. And the thing is, so I've tried, as I said, Monet's technique. I've tried other techniques. And the one thing is that the conditions in Northern Europe, where Louis Lorette lived and where Espalier originated, are quite different from that of most of continental U.S. First of all, the photo period's different. The days are much, much longer in summer and much shorter in winter. Also, at least traditionally, not so much these days, but the climate is different. In Northern Europe, traditionally or historically, it's been the winters are fairly mild and the summers stay fairly cool, and rainfall is always more even and moderate throughout the growing season. Whereas when I've tried the Lorette method specifically, a lot of times I'll do the Lorette cuts just as he had described it. So I'm in New York's Hudson Valley, so this is continental U.S. And so when I've tried Lorette's method, say if it's a dry period and then all of a sudden it gets rainy, all these shoots start growing like crazy. Or say it's say I do it and then it dry period continues. Sometimes all of a sudden just get a dead stub there. So I have to say it has not worked generally for me, the Lorette method. And I would say that it doesn't work anywhere in this country, except then I saw those pears trained. I don't know if it was the Lorette method, but I saw the pears where I showed at the Mount Vernon Research Station. Those were really nice espaliers. So maybe, but that is a more coastal climate. So, but this isn't to say that, you're listening to me talk and tell all about espalier, and now I'm going to tell you can't do it. You can do it. You just have to be a little more selective in the plants and that you choose to do it with. So, espalier can be done on the side of the Atlantic. And here's what I suggest then. For apples, the so-called columnar apples, these are new varieties that typically in catalogs are shown just a single stem and a small plant in a pot, single stem, just fruit up and down that stem. And these tend to bear very quickly and precociously. So, often the main thing is to get them to grow. So if you do want to try Espalier apples, try one of the columnar varieties. One thing I have to say about the columnar varieties, I have not tasted them, but people that I know that have tasted them say that they're generally not, they've been bred, they're genetically columnar. It's not because of the rootstock. They've been bred to be columnar, not for flavor. So maybe somebody has a different opinion of how they taste, but that's what I've heard. Another type, there's certain spur type apples. For instance, you have Red Delicious apple, but you also have many sports of Red Delicious, which are slight mutations that tend to be more spurry. And if they inherently have a tendency to make more spurs, there's better chance of making an Espalier. And then the other thing is, if you use most dwarfing rootstocks induce some amount of precocity to the plant. So if you use a Malling 9 rootstock, Bud 9 rootstock, a number of these dwarf rootstocks, this will also increase the chances for a successful Espalier. If I was going to choose one common fruit for Espalier, I would use Asian varieties of pear. They tend to be all they want to do is fruit, too much. So you have to be careful. You don't want to do, what mine are and what I suggest is I use a semi-dwarfing rootstock, like Old Home by Farmingdale, 87. And then I train them Espalier, because if you use too much of a dwarfing rootstock, they'll just fruit and it'll be too hard to get growth. I mean, you can train the stems more vertically, but it just makes it harder. So pears, and then I'll show later specifically red currants and gooseberries. The pruning is described. I have a book from England that gives step by step what to do, and it works 100% here. So before I start, when I take some questions, and then I'll go on more specifically.
All right, so we have several questions. Julian asks, how would you recommend to begin to develop any of these styles? Is it best to build a trellis system with a conduit and wire and attach the branches as you'd like to train them?
I would not use conduit, because metal, if it's in the sun, it can actually get too hot. Bamboo is really the ideal thing, but I would start with for conduit, just to hold the wire, to train the wire. So, and then, I mean, the way it's usually done, which I think works really well, you have conduit, wires, and then you have bamboo to make sure all the stems are straight, and you can tie the bamboo to the wires.
Okay. Olivia asks, can you espalier evergreen fruit trees like citrus and avocado?
Good question. I would say yes, and that's as far as I'll go, because I have no experience with that. But citrus fruit pretty readily, and I'm sure they'd make very beautiful espaliers, especially citrus. I don't know about avocado.
Okay, and I think that answers Juan Carlos's question. He was asking about tropical fruit trees as well. Let's see. Dan asks, can a tree on non-dwarfing rootstock apple tree be size controlled enough for a trellis trained tree by planting at a 45-degree angle? Do you know about the French method for dwarfing a self-root or seedling rootstock? Some sort of cutting near the base and how it is done?
I'm not familiar with that. I guess as far as dwarfing on as far as espalier on a non-dwarfing rootstock, it depends on if you had a columnar apple, that would probably work, and you could, by changing the angle. I'm not sure about this cutting at an angle. If the person wants to explain it more, that would help, but I don't know that.
Okay. Aaron asks, how realistic is it to create a short 4-foot tall espalier? If so, which fruit varieties would you recommend, and how often would you need to prune these shorter espaliers?
I would go with Asian. I think you could do it with Asian pear. And what's the question? How often would you prune it? You prune it as needed. My Asian pear varieties, I do sort of Lorette method, and I do it about 3 times a season. Basically, whenever it looks like things are at that right growth stage, and I can't see that it looks like an espalier, I cut them.
Okay. Eric asks, won't red currant and gooseberry espalier have the same bird problem that you described for mulberry?
Probably, except for some reason where I am, the birds do not touch red currants or gooseberries.
Okay. And Ed says, what rootstocks are best for cherries, peaches, and plums?
Peaches would be easy there are dwarfing, I guess there aren't any real dwarfing rootstocks for peaches, but peaches would be easy because they're very fruitful, and they're typically trained to a fan shape. Plums, depending on the plum, they're generally fairly fruitful, not as fruitful as peaches. And peaches are different from those. That peaches fruit on 1-year-old stems. So early on, I showed it the fan with I think I called it an arm, and then a side shoot, the branches. So you have to prune them in a certain way that make sure you always have 1-year-old stem for next year's fruit. It's not like an apple branch or a pear branch where you have those spurs on it, and those spurs are going to, spur system can be productive for 10 years. So you don't have to always get a lot of new growth there. But the peach, you need that new growth for next year's fruit. And plums, they actually make small spurs, and they also sometimes fruit on 1-year-old growth. So it's sort of in between. What was the third? Oh, cherries. I mean, there's a number of dwarfing rootstocks now for cherries and plums. The Krimsk is one, I think, for both of them. But there's also Giselle, and they induce fruitfulness. So I think it's possible.
Dan says he's seen fan espalier peach at Longwood Gardens inside the conservatory. Is it realistic to try an espalier, a non-spur type tree, such as a peach, which needs constant heavy wood renewal for fruiting on a 2-year-old wood?
Well, that's similar to what I just said about peaches, but you want renewal on 1-year-old wood. So you always have to have 1-year-old wood for next year's fruit. So it's a little different to pruning. In my pruning book, I have to say I have a whole chapter on espalier, and I go into more detail with the peaches of how to prune that.
Okay. And then I'll just throw in a comment. There's somebody here in Bloomington that does espalier, and when I visited his place several years ago, for apples, he was using Brayburn, Gold Rush, and Enterprise, and for pear, Kiefer. Pear was working for him. So.
Oh, but the rootstock would also be important.
Yes, definitely. And I don't know what his rootstock was. So, okay, we'll have you continue.
Okay, so this is what the columnar apples look like. This is from a One Green World website, and you can see how they're very fruitful, and it would probably be, it would be very easy to espalier one of these. Here's my espalier. This is an Asian pear. I have a number of them on a wall, not against a wall, on a built-up wall, and they start out to be. They were going to be en arcure. Remember the one that goes like that and like that and like that, and then they sort of make this living fence. Problem was, I used to have more of a deer problem, and the wall made it so the deer did not even have to bend down to eat anything. So the deer started munching on my pear trees when they were young, and totally messed up, not totally, but made a big dent in my design. So they don't look as exacting as I had hoped they would. And then I always figured I could cut the main stem down and start the whole thing over. But every year I was getting fruit, so I just bite the bullet and accept a less than perfect design, but lots of fruit every year. Here it is when it's fruiting. It actually does bear a lot of fruit. There's fruit all in here, but you can't see it. And you can see there and there. And this is the wall that the deer thought was a smorgasbord. Here's another pear, Asian pear, that I was bending the branches. So, you bend the branches And this is, I might have thinned this already, once or twice. It's just so much fruit. This is a fruit that I espalier. This is my greenhouse. I have because I obviously, where I live, zone 5A, I can't grow fig trees outside, so I have fig trees in my greenhouse, and it's a cool greenhouse. It gets quite cool in the winter, down in the 30s. And the nice thing about fig for espalier, well, first of all, the way I used to grow them is I would just let them grow, and figs bear on new growing stems, which is fairly unique. Apples bear on stems that might be a few years old, peaches on 1-year-old stem, and most temperate zone fruits bear on stems. They make the fruit buds a year before the fruit buds open into flowers and then bear fruit. But a fig tree can actually bear fruit on a new growing stem. So a stem starts to grow, and as it grows, it makes fruit here, and here. And throughout the bearing season, it starts ripening there, and they just ripen successively up. So what I have here, it's trained. This is a permanent arm. This is a permanent arm. And then there's a permanent trunk. And then these are the fruiting, I guess they're fruiting arms, but you can see some fruit on them. And so every year I cut all these down right to the arm there, all these down to the right to the arm there, which is a heavy heading cut. So I get a lot of vigorous growth, and I only allow one stem from each stub there, but you get all this vigorous growth, and that's where fruit is born. You can see there it is after pruning. So it's nice because it's very easy to prune. And then also in winter, when I grow salad greens on the ground beneath there's nothing shading them. Plus the figs lose their leaves. And then here you can see the fruit growth. Figs also, some figs can bear fruit on 1-year-old wood in addition. So sometimes when I leave a little stub here, the fruit bearing on 1-year-old growth starts to bear, and that bears much earlier in the season. So you can see that's ripening. And here's the new shoot growing with fruits that'll start ripening later in the season. But it works out really well as far as easy to prune, looks nice, and bears a lot of fruit, as you can see here. And these are some of the varieties. So let me get into pruning currants, and this would also work for gooseberries. I like to grow currants because I think the fruit is so pretty, especially like when you have light shining behind it. You can see the seeds just floating inside. So currants actually bear on 1, 2, and 3-year-old wood. And what I'm training to, this was along my vegetable garden, I want to train them along the fence to a single stem that branches, so it'd be a T shape. So I cut off all the side shoots, or I shorten the side shoots because it's good to leave them sometimes just to help thicken up this trunk to be. And there I am pinching off some of the side shoots. And then once the leader or the trunk gets as high as I want the plant to grow, I just cut it off. I should also say that currant bears fruit very readily, as do a lot of berries. So it's not that hard to get it to fruit or anything like that. It's mostly I'm trying to make a decorative form. So once it gets as high as I want it to get, I just cut it off, which stimulates growth of buds just beneath the cut, and those are going to make the 2 side arms. So you can see here the 2 side arms, and then I'm going to bend them down both for decoration and get them to fruit even more. So here they are bent down. And ways to bend them, there's basically 2 ways to bend them. Some people train the 2 arms to, say, a bamboo pole, and you might start at a 45-degree angle so you get a nice balance of fruiting and shoot growth, because you want this shoot to keep extending till its full length. And then as it gets more and more to its full length, you just lower the bamboo, and this keeps everything nice and straight. And then once it is full length, you have it horizontal. And the other way to do it is to you leave the end free, and this is also because of auxin thing. The ends will naturally curve up and start to become more vigorous, and you want to leave a little vigor there because you want them to keep getting wider. But then as it grows, you keep tying the stem down along that length, just leaving the end to grow up and keep expanding. And then you get, so then this is the way it would look, as it starts to get older, and you can see they're starting to get some vertical growths here, which doesn't make it look like an espalier. I want it to really be nice and crisp, a T. So, here I am still, I think, tying it down. There we go. And you can see this fruit even coming off this trunk here. But so now here's all tied down. And so the nice thing about this, it only takes 2 prunings a year. So the first pruning will be during the growing season, early in the growing season, in June sometime, when it starts to make vertical shoots here. You shorten all the vertical shoots, and it doesn't have to be exact. You shorten all the vertical shoots to 5 inches, about 5 inches. Nothing exact about it. You just go along, quickly shorten them all to 5 inches, like I'm doing here. And then the second pruning is that winter. All those shoots you shorten to 5 inches, you shorten them to about 1 inch. Once again, it does not have to be exact. So here it is at 5 inches before pruning. Here it is pruning it. And then if you do that, that's the way it looks when it's in flower. And then there it is in bloom. And these, in this picture, you can see these have all been shortened to 5 inches. And the only problem with this is you see the fruit really adds to the decorative aspect. And I found that I couldn't pick the fruit because that would really ruin the espalier. It wouldn't look that nice. But I have other currants that I could pick for fruit. Anyway, that's a simple, only 2 prunings a season, and it's a simple way to do it. The one main problem actually is a currant naturally wants to be a bush, and bushes naturally want to make new stems from the ground, and bushes naturally don't have long-lived stems that become trunks where they could become trees. So these stems do have a limited life, and after a certain number of years, they'll sort of just peter out and die. And always the plant will be trying to send up new shoots from ground level. So it's not the way the plant normally wants to grow, but you can force it to do that. So finally, if you want more information, there's my book, and you can get them on my blog or from the usual sources. I also talk a little about pruning and the science behind it, and a lot of other things like water movement, soil, pollinate, all sorts of topics in this book. And then I have to put in one more commercial message because I just put out a new book. So there's a book called Fruit, and this is not a gardening book per se. It's also it's about plants, and it's about fruit, which we like. And I'll just say quickly, from late 1800s to about 1946, I think it was, the USDA paid 20 artists to paint pictures of fruit, both for commercial purposes and for educational purposes. And they painted 7,500 drawings of all different kinds of fruits. And a publisher contacted me and asked me to choose 250 drawings, paintings. They're all watercolor paintings, 250 of them, group them some way that I wanted to. So I made various chapters and write an introduction to the book and an introduction to each chapter. And it's just a very pretty little book. So you might be interested in that. But let me get back to that. Oh, I could leave it on this.
No, it's fantastic, Lee. Thank you so much. So I think what I'll do is I can I'll pull down the slides and we can just have you respond
Okay.
some of the remaining questions.
Okay.
So let's see. So just kind of dialing back a little bit to the conversation about apples. Gil from Skipley Farm had commented on Collinear Golden Sentinel and North Pole, grown in Western Washington, are substantially decent. Both are clean of disease, store well, and have excellent flavor. And then Shane added on, the new Czech bred columnars are also very good for disease and taste. So
I sort of found a little humorous. What was the word? Substantially decent.
Substantially decent.
I have to say, where I am at least, and this is true a lot of in the East, it's hard to grow apples because of a lot of pests and things like that. So I limit the amount of apples I grow, and I want to grow just the best tasting apples there are. And even if I don't get some years, so I'm really finicky about flavor in apples. And so I only have 5 dwarf trees, and if I don't like them, I cut them off and regraft them.
Well, somebody growing apples here in the South, I hear exactly what you're saying. So Shane added, the new Czech bred columnars are also very good for disease and taste. Harmony, Harold, Cumulus, etc. So that was great. Thank you. So back to figs. Someone asked, what variety fig were you, what cultivar were you growing?
Well, I have a lot of varieties of figs. And when people ask what cultivar, the names of figs are really totally discombobulated. First of all, figs have been cultivated for thousands of years, and they're very easy to propagate. And as people moved around the world, they would take a stem and use that for propagation. And a lot of times they didn't know what the name of it was, and then they give it a name. So, for instance, the fig called brown turkey, which is very common. It also has another name. Lee's perpetual is one name, and now I forgot. Actually, I forgot the other names, but it's got a whole list, like about 20 names. And there's another variety called brown turkey that's California brown turkey. So they're all mixed up. But I will tell you that so I grow about 20 varieties of figs. For a second, let me grab something quickly here. I did write a book last year.
I was going to say, I'll give it a plug if you don't.
Figs in cold climates. But so I have about 20 varieties, but I'm going to reduce the number of figs. It's really, for this climate, it's really too much to handle. And I grow a lot of them in pots, but besides the greenhouse. But the one you saw in the greenhouse was one that a friend saw some Hasidic Jews in the Bronx digging up this fig tree to move it somewhere. So he took a cutting of it and he gave it to the farmer at Stone Barns, which is a well-known farm here. And then he gave me a cutting, but they had named it because nobody knows what the name was. It was called Rabbi Samuel, in commemorating that. And I've looked at a lot of different descriptions of figs, and I have a whole book that has maybe 100 figs, and I can't figure out what it is. And but the other one's my favorite figs. I also grow San Piero, I grow Excel, Cadota, and one that I do grow brown turkey, and it's not the best of the best, but it's a very good and very reliable fig.
And do you find that they all perform fairly similarly in your efforts to espalier?
Oh yeah, very. It's like I like it because it used to be when I had them in the greenhouse, especially growing, wantonly. It was there's always certain decisions on what to cut, and also they didn't spread out; they would just be too thick. And now they're all nice and orderly and bear well and easy to pick. Yeah.
Okay. So related, Eric asks, why don't you leave a longer stub on those, say 12 inches or so, to get more early figs?
That's a good point. First of all, it has to be a variety that does bear the early figs. Not all do. And the second thing is, and I haven't figured this out yet, and I've asked people and I've read a lot about it. I'm not sure if the early figs always occur at the bottom. They did in that one picture, and I've tried doing that, and then I didn't get early figs. I'm not sure why. And I'm working on this, trying to figure out why it bears on a stub, or maybe it just bears, because sometimes they bear at the tip of last year's growth, but that wouldn't be good for my system. I'd have to leave long ones. So I'm not sure why it does that, but that is an idea I've tried, and it wasn't, works sometimes and not others.
Interesting. So we talked about different rootstocks a minute ago. What rootstocks are your Asian pears on?
Old Home by Farmingdale, 87.
Okay, great.
Also, somebody asked if you can keep a apple tree, was it, I think, to, or some Espalier to 4 feet. So just the story is that I had a rootstock, Marling 27, which is a super dwarfing rootstock. The finished tree is typically about 6 or 7 feet tall. And I grafted wine sap apple on it. And, I have other apple trees, so I didn't care that much about getting a large yield, but I have a photo which I should have included of it. I wasn't espaliering it, but at about it's probably like less than 3 feet high. It just stopped growth because I let it fruit on purpose. I just wanted to see it, and I have this picture of it's 3 feet high, just sort of, and it has 2 fruits on it because you don't have that much stem.
Right.
So. But that just shows if you let a fruit, the fruiting can also affect growth, and let the stems bend over, and you have a dwarfing rootstock. Put all that together, you can get a super dwarf tree.
That makes sense. Well, thank you.
Oh,
Right,
and
so,
one other thing I just saw. Somebody asked about dwarfing peaches. There are the genetic dwarf peaches, which they'll just like make a mound about 2 feet high. Or 3 feet high, depending on which one is. And these are just like the columnar apples. And the genetic dwarf peaches don't taste great either, but they're very decorative. I mean, they just make this nice mound. When I used to work for the USDA, they had a whole row of them, and the spring was beautiful. It's just like this low mound of pink flowers.
that's great. We've thought about doing fans, really because we're home growers, so we're not looking for a great deal of volume. Right. And with the fluctuating temperatures, we're in the mountains of North Georgia here. And so we get those in many places around the country and the world now do. We get these fluctuating temperatures and these late killer frosts. And so we thought at a smaller scale, it'll be easier to help with frost protection.
Well, what some people do, if you read some British books, and this would work here too, if you do it against a wall, and then they would have sort of like a bamboo screen or something, and they just drop it in during there's a frost. They just roll it down in front of it, which is super easy. You just roll it down or up and protect it from frost.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. Okay, let's shift back to currants. Does the currant method, that's funny, currant, the current method you described, work for black currants as well?
No. Because black currants would not make a good espalier. Black currants fruit best on 1-year-old wood, and best growing from ground level, and to some degree on 2-year-old wood. So you don't want to have a permanent framework for black currants. Okay.
And when you showed us that beautiful picture with the red fruit, about how long did that take for it to get to that point? About how many years would you say?
People always ask me that, and I have to say I have no memory of that.
Yes, I understand. But I imagine it was probably a few. I mean,
yeah. Oh, yeah. It looked like from the thickness of the trunk, although that was after a few years. It had been doing that. I would say, probably took 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. That sounds great. Let's see. We've had some comments from Dan, who's saying that horizontal cordon espalier figs can be done outside, close to the ground, then cover in the winter with hooped closed cell foam tunnel. And I know in your book, because I've read it, you talk about methods for covering and mulching, whether you're using like a straw mulch or something like that, heavily mulching. So I think it's the same thing. Will winter protect and start early growth? Because okay, so this is great. Thank you, Dan, for that.
And I'm doing that same thing, but mine are just young, so I haven't, gone through enough winters with this.
Mm-hmm. What is the best form for dwarf plums?
I'd say a fan, because dwarf plums are more, they do have some spurs, but they're more, somewhat. It depends on what kind of plum it is. Also, like Asian plums fruit more like peaches, and European plums just do fruit more on spurs, and then you have a lot of the hybrid plums. So, but I'd say a fan generally.
Okay, that's a great point. Eric wants to know, what are your 5 apples?
I knew somebody was going to ask that. So if I can remember them. So my favorite, which I have to say is not the best tasting, but so productive and so disease resistant, is Liberty. And I do like the taste. Macoun, which is a great tasting apple. One that a lot of people haven't heard of is Hudson's Golden Gem and Ashmead's Kernel, which a lot of people know. And the last one is Egremont Russet, I think.
Great. What kind of flavor does that have?
Actually, I'm trying to think. Mine hasn't born yet. I've tasted a lot of apples in the past. I can't remember what they taste like, but yes, those are my favorite.
We're fans of russet apples. They're so frequently so good tasting.
I like the way they look too better.
Yeah, it's too bad we don't see them in stores. Okay, so Bradley asks, how well would Asian persimmon respond to attempts to espalier?
I think you could do Asian persimmon because they. I know about Asian persimmon, but I haven't grown them because too far north here. But I would say it could espalier, and also would be very decorative because the fruits are so beautiful.
Yeah. So here's a question from John. Any experience with pears on cotton Easter as a dwarf inducing rootstock?
Cotoneaster.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sure it can dwarf on it, but I don't know anything about. I know I've read it various times. I can't remember how long lived. A lot of times a graft will take, but it'll just peter out after some number of years. But any dwarfing rootstock, I think this is generally true, will induce precocity. So that would be good. But why not just use an acknowledged, dwarfing rootstock like one of the old home like Farmingdale ones. And there's also a super dwarfing rootstock that I'm just starting to use now, but I've used it for a few years now, called Pyrodwarf, P233. Okay. 233. Yeah. So I would do that because there's less chance of incompatibility.
Yeah, and if you're going to put that much effort into it, it would be,
especially if it lives for 6 years and it's getting this beautiful espalier, and then all of a sudden just breaks off.
Yeah, that would be tragic. All right, Ryan asks, which type of grafting technique do you prefer to use for your apples?
I usually do a bark graft where you have you make slits in the bark because you get a lot of insurance there because you can put, depending on how big the stub is, you can put a lot of stems in it. So and then you just make a slice in the cyan, pull back stick it in there, and you can do a whole bunch of them. And if it's a smaller, then I'll do a cleft graft.
Okay. Have you seen Franken-grafted espaliers?
Was that more than one variety?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. Different varieties of can have different types of growth. I know they're very popular. People buy it's hard enough to do an espalier correctly, but then to have each variety growing a little differently. Typically, what happens after a number of years is one will die out just because it'll be overshadowed by the vigor of some other variety. Just from seeing people that have had them. People generally don't, they buy an espalier because they love the idea, but then they don't know anything about pruning them, and it just becomes this wild thing with one side overgrowing the other.
Right. I don't think you talked about spur renewal pruning. Is that something that once you've had an established tree for a while? That's something that
so the spurs, I said they can fruit for, be productive for 10 years or more. And picture them like little trees. And after a while, just like any part of a tree, it needs to it needs some younger wood to fruit better, because it'll start branching more and more and more. So you can prune it just like a tree. You can remove some part of the spur. You can shorten some part of the spur. But sometimes, I guess eventually, sometimes the whole stem can need renewal also. But but definitely the spurs after a number of years need to be renewed, or not renewed, renovated, which means you can shorten between doing heading cuts and thinning cuts on these little growths, keep them invigorated.
Fantastic, thank you. So Shane says, I've bred several new seedling peaches from the Sunset Super Dwarf Peach crossed with White Opal Peach that are so far turning out to have both the genetic dwarfing and much better flavor. Amazingly precocious too. Most grew fruit in just a single year from planting the seeds.
Wow.
Yeah, that's great. Shane, thank you so much for sharing that story.
Share the seed too.
Right? This is what we love about NAFEX, right? We share our material. So Juan Carlos asks, we have seen Japanese pear orchards working with an umbrella shape, horizontal instead of vertical. Do you know if there's an advantage to using this method?
Umbrella shapes, they'll be like this, I assume. Horizontal, like this.
I'm trying to imagine what that looks like.
Yeah, I can picture this.
Interesting. So Juan Carlos, I don't know if you can jump in that in the Q&A and explain further what you're, how you're describing, so that I can articulate this a little bit better. That would be great. And let me ask you, Lee, when was the first time you started doing espalier work?
I think, I think it was a long time ago, because it really just fascinated me, the idea of, the art and the science and the fruit. It seems like you get a little of everything: good taste, a little science. And I know sometimes I've said that, espalier is applying science artfully or art scientifically. It's just so interesting to see how, and it's not like it's a formula. It's just there's a certain amount of known and unknown.
Yeah. So Juan Carlos says they're sort of shaped like a roof, which is interesting. It sounds extremely intriguing, although I can't quite visualize it myself. So
seems so, like maybe like that.
Maybe so, angled. Yeah.
Angled downward. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
Any advantage to it? It just seems like if it's like that, just the top, you're going to get a lot of, right at the apex, you're going to get a lot of vertical growth, which, you can just keep cutting off.
And he says they're totally flat.
Also, right, because typically when things are angled downward, they, like say on not an espalier tree, but like say a full-size apple tree, the goal is really to make most of the fruiting stems, the horizontal stems, the ones going up are too vigorous, and ones going down will bear a lot of fruit, but it's typically poor quality fruit.
So Juan Carlos, I can picture what you're talking about. It's like he's talking about like almost like a roof. Where it's horizontal and flat.
Yeah, I think that sounds like something they probably do in Japan. I think I've seen pictures. Was it fruit trees? Yeah, I think it was fruit trees where they have this trellis and the whole thing. It's just like you go into this field and it's just a roof.
Yeah, he says that's exactly what he was talking about.
The problem is it seems like it's hard to get it. You're going to get a lot of stems going vertically. And I don't know if I imagined this or not, but could I have read that they put on snowshoes and they walk on top of?
Interesting. Yeah, so Richard is echoing this, that the Japanese method for pears results in a flat roof with no drooping. Very, very. So,
yeah, it just, to me, as I said, a little hard to get above, to get at all those shoots.
So Gil says, I found the Arcure elliptical arches method to be the simplest, festooned to each other and turned into a mile-wide spiral that dwarfs stand on their own. That sounds pretty amazing.
Wow. Found it somewhere?
He is just saying his experience is that's been the simplest.
It is pretty simple. Yeah. Except
and beautiful.
Except if deer ruin
it. Let's not talk about deer. All right, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to take just these last two questions, and I'm grateful for everybody for all these fantastic questions in this dialogue. So Let's see. Dan was encouraged us to talk a little bit more about summer pruning. He did apple trees 3 times per summer, and each time there was about 6 inches of new growth. He left about 3 buds at the first prune, 1 or 2 at the second, and none at the third pruning just before September. Does that sound about right to you?
Not necessarily, but if it worked, can he say where he is and if it worked?
Yeah, Dan, throw in the Q&A where you are. And while he does that, Julian asked, could you speak a little bit more about the disadvantages of pruning or training branches downward or in a weeping style? You said the quality of the fruit isn't great. Would those branches eventually lose vigor?
Right, because they're very weakly growing, and not only are they weakly growing, but they have to feed this fruit. So it's just the fruit typically will be smaller, not as flavorful, and just not what you want.
Okay, so John Cummins' son James is on with us today, and he asked, didn't you write a thing for Cornell a long time ago on pruning in the Hudson Valley?
I don't know if I think I wrote something on pruning, but
with 4 sheets, he said.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, good memory. I love it. Okay, and Dan answers that this was in Southeast, is that Pennsylvania, Dan? So, Zone 6B, now Zone 7. And
it was successful, does he say?
He hasn't answered that yet, but I'm guessing it was if he's asking that question. So
a lot of times people, they get the tracery of the branches and they think, well, I got an espalier, but really, to me, especially after seeing all those awesome ones in Europe, right, that I like to see fruit. I mean, you see fruit just clothing it from one end to the other.
Richard says, I think that David Silva is working on I never pronounce it correctly, but I know what it is. Amelanchier.
Yeah.
As a dwarfing rootstock for pear.
Oh, well, David knows a lot about pears.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Awesome. All right. I'm going to close out that Q&A with thanks to everybody for such great questions and the opportunity for such a fantastic dialogue. So, Lee, you've been a member forever, but let me thank you on behalf of all of our current members for being here and really helping our conference get rolling this year. It was fantastic. So
it was my pleasure.
Thank you. So to everyone else, on behalf of NAFEX, we hope that you'll stay tuned. We have 6 more sessions to go. We have 4 tomorrow, and I was interested to note our 4 tomorrow include backyard orchards for homestead and community, the dirt on building healthy soil with Jeff Lowenfels, and the fun fact is that Lee and Jeff went to high school together. So even though Jeff is now living up in Alaska, they grew up together and they're good friends. So if you see them heckling one another in these forums, you know why. They have a history. And then we've got managing pests and diseases with minimal inputs, kind of how to build healthy plants naturally, and permaculture orchards, polycultural design, and regenerative practices. It sounds very techy, but it's basically going to be a very cool session on how to interplant and just create, multi-species orchards. So that'll be a fantastic one. And then we have 2 on Saturday. They're a little more focused on apples, reconstructing the apple family tree, about genetic testing and apple identification. And then closing out with our keynote with Stephen Edholm on grassroots apple breeding. So I'm super excited. Lee has given us his a PDF of his PowerPoint presentation. And on the conference page, you'll see a link to bonus resources where you can download that. He has another attachment as well. So be following up. This recording should be up in a few days for anybody that wants to revisit it like I do. The most important thing is stay connected with us. We're on social, and always be checking back at nafex.org. And again, thank you all so much for being here tonight. And thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, Chris Heater, our president, for jumping in and helping me with the Q&A. I appreciate it. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.